Thank you, Bernard. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. And let me add my welcome and thanks to you all for joining BP Week and for the launch of this year's Energy Outlook. There are lots of differences to this year's Outlook, not least this launch venue in a very high-tech film studio. I'm not sure the basement room in BP's offices that we normally use will ever quite feel the same again. Bernard, please note. And I'm missing the crowd of familiar faces that normally join me for the launch. I know watching online is not the same, but do stay with us. The issues surrounding the energy transition are hugely interesting and have never been more important. Please submit your questions as I go along for the Q&A session that follows, always the most fun and interesting part. And as we did last year, as part of the Q&A session, we plan to conduct a poll of your views about the energy transition, so stay tuned for that as well. Despite all these changes, two aspects of the outlook remain the same. First, the energy outlook is still very much a team effort. That includes the other members of the economics team who have been stretching Zoom to its very limits in recent months, as well as a host of BP colleagues from far and wide who have contributed their expertise. The economics team holds the pen, but the insights come from right across BP, so a huge thanks to all those involved. Second, the purpose of the outlook has not changed. In particular, the role of the energy outlook is not to predict or forecast how the energy system is likely to change over time. All the scenarios discussed in this outlook will be wrong. We can't predict the future. Moreover, we know we can't predict the future. Rather, the role of the outlook is to help better understand the range of uncertainty we face, which developments seem pretty similar across a range of scenarios, and which are highly dependent on the precise policy or technology assumptions made. Improving our understanding of this uncertainty is important input into designing a strategy that is robust and resilient to the range of different outcomes we may face. As Bernard said, that's why we're launching this year's Outlook as part of BP Week, which is looking in depth at BP's new strategy. A key part of BP's new ambition is also to help the world get to net zero. In that context, I hope this year's Outlook will be of use to others who are seeking ways to accelerate the energy transition and get to net zero. So lots of new analysis in this year's bumper booklet. If we start to take a peek inside, and I promise that's the only Harry Potter trick I have for today, much of the analysis is focused around three main scenarios which explore the possible nature of the energy transition over the next 30 years. Rapid, shown here in orange, is based on a series of policy measures led by a significant increase in carbon prices, such that carbon emissions from energy use fall by around 70% by 2050. And this scenario is broadly comparable to the rapid transition scenario included in last year's Outlook. Net zero, in blue, assumes that policies in rapid are reinforced by significant shifts in societal behaviours and preferences, which further accelerate the reduction in carbon emissions. The design of net zero is based on the view that there are limits to the extent to which a really accelerated energy transition can be driven solely by government policies. Government policies may need to be reinforced by shifting societal preferences. And as the name suggests, carbon emissions from energy use are almost entirely eliminated in net zero, falling by over 95% by 2050. And finally, business as usual, or BAU, shown in green, which assumes that government policies, technologies, and social preferences continue to evolve in a manner and speed seen over the recent past. A continuation of that progress, albeit slow, is enough to cause carbon emissions to peak in the mid-2020s, but little progress is actually made in decarbonising the energy system, with carbon emissions by 2050 around only 10% below their current levels. BAU is broadly comparable to last year's evolving transition scenario. Primary energy demand increases over the next 10 to 15 years in rapid and net zero before broadly plateauing as gains in energy efficiency accelerate. In contrast, energy demand grows over the entire outlook in BAU. In all three scenarios, the growth in energy demand is driven entirely by emerging economies as prosperity and living standards improve. In the main booklet, we describe how it's possible to compare these carbon pathways with the range of scenarios included in the 2019 IPCC report, where the pink swathe here shows a range of IPCC scenarios judged to be consistent with maintaining temperature rises well below 2 degrees C, and the blue swathe, the range of scenarios consistent with maintaining temperature rises below 1.5 degrees C. And as you can see here with rapid, it's broadly in the middle of that pink 2.5 degree range throughout the next 30 years. For net zero, the initial pace of decline in carbon emissions is a little bit above the 1.5 degree swathe, but it falls to the lower half of that blue 1.5 degree swathe by the end of the outlook. As always, the full booklet contains lots more than I can do justice to today. So if today's discussion whets your appetite, please do go online and delve deeper. Today's discussion is built around 8 questions. Although there are many, many questions surrounding the energy transition, most of my discussions with Bernard and Julia and the rest of the strategy team over the past year, as a new strategy has been developed, have revolved around these 8 questions. In a world of huge uncertainty, what do we know about how the energy system might change? How might the coronavirus pandemic affect the outlook? What are the prospects for oil demand and how are they shaped by the mobility revolution? What role could natural gas play in the energy transition? Just how quickly will renewable energy grow over time, where the options seem to be somewhere between really quick and really, really quick? How will the growing importance of electricity and power markets shape the energy transition? What role for hydrogen and bioenergy as the world moves to a low-carbon energy system? And finally, what are the potential dangers and costs of delaying the energy transition? What do we know about how the energy system may change? Now, one way into this question is to consider changes in the energy system which are common across all 3 of the scenarios. Although the 3 scenarios, rapid, net zero, and BAU, are by no means comprehensive, they do span a wide spectrum of possible transition paths and outcomes. As such, if some features of the energy system are common across all 3 scenarios, that may give us some confidence that they might materialize in some shape or form. In that context, 3 features in particular are worth highlighting. First, the role of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas declines over time, falling from around 85% of primary energy today to between 60 and 65 and 20% across these 3 scenarios. In all 3 scenarios, this corresponds to a decline in the absolute demand for fossil fuels over the next 30 years. That would be entirely unprecedented. In the modern history of energy, there has never been a sustained decline in the consumption of any traded fuel. The shares of coal and oil have declined over time, but not their absolute levels of consumption. That changes in all 3 scenarios. Second, the growth in primary energy is dominated by renewable energy, which for the purposes of the outlook includes wind, solar, geothermal, and bioenergy, but excludes hydroelectricity. The share of renewables in primary energy grows from around 5% today to between 20 and 60% in the 3 scenarios. In doing so, renewables in all 3 scenarios, including BAU, penetrate the energy system more quickly than any fuel in modern history. Again, unprecedented developments common across all 3 scenarios. Third, the growth in renewables is supported by the increasing role of electricity as the world continues to electrify, with a share of electricity in total final consumption, again growing in all 3 scenarios. Three features of energy demand apparent in all three scenarios: a decreasing role for fossil fuels, increasing share of renewable energy, supported by the growing electrification of the energy system. Another way into this question of what do we know, rather than identify common trends, is to ask how the structure of the energy system may change if and when there is a sustained transition to a lower carbon energy system. To do this, we can focus on how the energy system evolves in rapid, which, to remind you, is broadly consistent with maintaining temperature rises well below 2 degrees C. The point here is not to focus on the precise profiles in rapid, since these will vary across different scenarios. Rather, I want to highlight some more generic features of how the energy system might evolve if and when there is a material transition to a lower carbon energy system. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you may have spotted that this chart starts in 1900. So it's covering a wide span of history. The point of doing so is to highlight how, for much of modern history, the global energy system has tended to be dominated by a single energy source. For the first half of much of the last century, much of this was dominated by coal, shown here in black. And as black declined, you saw an increasing role for oil, shown here in green. In contrast, the energy transition in rapid means that for much of the next 20 years, the global energy mix is far more diversified than previously seen, with oil, natural gas, non-fossil fuels, renewables and coal all providing material parts of the energy system. This greater variety of fuels means that the mix is likely to be increasingly driven by customer choice rather than fuel availability, which has been the dominant driver for much of the past 100 years. This more diversified fuel mix will also increase the need for integration across different energy sources and carriers. Linking back to the previous chart, the growing differentiation is further enhanced in rapid by the increasing importance of electricity and, to a lesser extent, hydrogen. These energy carriers are more costly and inefficient to transport long distances than traditional hydrocarbons, causing energy markets to become more localized. The increasing diversification of the fuel mix also leads to greater competition, both across different forms of energy as they compete for market share, and within individual fossil fuels as resource owners compete to ensure their energy sources are produced against a backdrop of falling demand. This heightened competition increases the bargaining power of consumers, with economic rents shifting away from traditional upstream producers. To repeat, the precise timing and extent of these changes will vary across different scenarios. There's nothing special about rapid. But a transition to a lower carbon energy system, if and when it happens, seems likely to be characterized by at least some of the generic features highlighted in rapid. A more diversified fuel mix driven by customer choice, supported by increasing levels of integration across fuels. Increasingly localized energy markets, and growing competition with economic rents shifting away from the upstream. That's what I wanted to say on this first question. Turning to the next question, how has COVID-19 affected the outlook? The COVID-19 pandemic is primarily a humanitarian crisis, with the reported death toll as of now exceeding 900,000 people. The fact that the number of new cases continues to increase, and there is still no generally approved vaccine, means that any assessment of the ultimate impact of the virus on the economy and the energy system is obviously very preliminary and highly uncertain. The central view used in all three scenarios, shown here for rapid, is that economic activity partially recovers from the impact of the pandemic over the next few years as the virus is brought under control and restrictions are eased, but some effects persist. The pandemic is assumed to reduce the level of global GDP by around 2.5% in 2025, increasing to around 3.5% in 2050. These economic impacts fall disproportionately on emerging economies, particularly India, Brazil, and Africa, whose economic structures are most exposed to the economic fallout from COVID-19. Energy demand is assumed to be reduced by around 2.5% in 2025 and 3% in 2050. The majority of this impact stems from the weaker economic environment, but there is also an assumed impact from the various behavioural changes triggered by the pandemic as people travel less, switch away from public transport into alternative modes of travel, and work from home more frequently. Many of these behavioural changes are projected to dissipate over time as the virus subsides and public confidence is restored. But some changes, particularly increased working from home, are assumed to persist. As shown here in these green bars, the impact from the virus are most pronounced on oil demand, reducing oil consumption by around 3 million barrels a day in 2025 and 2 million barrels a day in 2050. The greater impact on oil demand largely reflects the disproportionate impact of the virus on emerging economies, which are the principal source of oil demand growth over the outlook, and to a lesser extent, the impact of the behavioural changes, which are concentrated in the transport sector. Although the assumed impacts from COVID-19 don't change the fundamental shape of any of the scenarios, 3 other points are worth highlighting. First, the impact of COVID-19 on oil demand means that in both rapid and net zero, the level of demand never recovers to its pre-crisis level. As such, the pandemic has the effect of bringing forward the implied peaking in oil demand to 2019 in both rapid and net zero. The same is also true for the profile of carbon emissions from energy use, which also peaks in 2019 in both rapid and net zero. Second, there is considerable risk that the impact from coronavirus may be greater than the central assumption. The main booklet considers an alternative case, shown here in the chart on the right, in which COVID-19 reduces the level of global GDP by 4% in 2025 and by almost 10% in 2050, with correspondingly bigger impacts on the demand for energy. Third, it's possible that the fragilities exposed by COVID-19, together with a growing commitment to build back better, supported by unprecedented levels of government intervention, may help to accelerate the energy transition. That possibility is not explored explicitly in the outlook, which doesn't attach weights to the different scenarios. But if that were the case, the impact of COVID-19 on the future energy system could be far more substantial. The third question concerns the outlook for oil demand and how that might be affected by the mobility revolution. Oil demand falls over the outlook in all 3 scenarios. This decline is most pronounced in rapid and net zero, shown here, in which after peaking in 2019 at close to 100 million barrels a day, oil demand by 2050 falls to a little below 50 million barrels a day in rapid and to around 25 million barrels a day in net zero. The outlook for oil consumption in BAU, shown here in green, is more resilient, with demand recovering to around its pre-COVID levels, where it remains for the next 10 to 15 years, before gradually edging down over the last 10 or 15 years or so to around 90 million barrels a day by 2050. The scale and pace of these falls stems primarily from the increasing efficiency and electrification of road transportation, with the declining use of oil within road transport, shown here by these 2 blue bars for the 3 scenarios, accounting for between 50 and 60% of the total reduction in oil demand in rapid and net zero, and an even greater proportion in BAU. If we dig a little deeper into the role of electrification, the electrification of road transportation is most pronounced in rapid and net zero, supported by ever-tightening vehicle efficiency standards, higher carbon pricing, and especially within net zero, a further shift in societal preferences towards electric vehicles. By 2050, upwards of 3/4 of all kilometres travelled by passenger cars and trucks are electrified in rapid and net zero. Even in business as usual, over 25% of road transportation is electrified in 2050, compared with less than 1% today. On the passenger car side, the steep rise in electrification of road transportation from the early 2030s is driven by the interaction of electric vehicles with shared mobility and autonomous vehicles, the three elements combining to revolutionise the mobility sector. The emergence of fully autonomous vehicles from the early 2030s in rapid and net zero significantly reduces the cost of shared mobility services, causing consumers to shift away from public transport and private vehicles into these so-called robo-taxis. Think fully autonomous Uber or DD. Now, the important point here is that the vast majority of these robo-taxis are electrified. That partly reflects the lower running costs of electric vehicles, which really matters for robo-taxis since they are driven far more intensely than privately owned cars. It's also supported by the improved air quality associated with electric vehicles, especially in major cities and towns where the use of robo-taxis is concentrated. And as you can see here from the chart on the right, the increasing competitiveness of robo-taxis, combined with their greater intensity of use, means that by the early 2040s, in all three scenarios, they account for around 40 to 50% of passenger car kilometres powered by electricity. The nature of the mobility revolution, particularly with the emergence of autonomous vehicles, means electrification is likely to go hand in hand with the increasing importance of shared mobility services. That's the interaction of oil demand with the mobility revolution. The next question concerns the role that natural gas might play in the energy transition. The outlook for natural gas is more resilient in all three scenarios. Take, for example, the outlook in rapid, shown here in orange. You may recall that oil consumption in rapid peaked in 2019 and fell by around 50% by 2050. In contrast, consumption of natural gas in rapid continues to grow for the next 15 years or so before gradually edging back to just below its current levels. This more resilient outlook for natural gas reflects two main components. First, the role of natural gas in supporting a shift away from coal in fast-growing developing economies, particularly in Asia, over the next 15 years or so. And second, the role of natural gas when combined with carbon capture, use and storage, CCUS, as a source of near-zero carbon energy as the world increasingly decarbonises. Let's take these two components in turn. The role of natural gas in supporting a shift away from coal stems from the possibility that renewables and other non-fossil fuels may not be able to grow sufficiently quickly to replace coal on their own, at least in the short to medium run. This may particularly be the case in emerging economies, in which energy demand is growing quickly, making it hard for non-fossil fuels to both meet the growing new demand and replace the existing coal. In these situations, natural gas may also need to increase for a period to help fill the gap left by coal. This next chart illustrates the supporting role. The idea of the chart is to consider the role of gas in a scenario in which there's an accelerated energy transition, such as in rapid, compared with a slower transition like BAU. And the chart focuses on India and other parts of developing Asia, where energy demand is growing quickly, and so there is greatest need for this supporting role. The chart compares how the shares of different types of energy evolving rapid relative to those in BAU. In particular, the black line here shows how the share of coal in RAPID declines far more quickly than in BAU, these negative numbers, reflecting the faster pace of decarbonisation. A similar but less pronounced trend is also seen here for oil, shown in green. Much of this decline in the growth of coal and oil is offset by a faster growth in the share of renewables and other non-fossil fuels, shown by the blue line here. Indeed, renewable energy increases more than 30-fold by 2050. But even that is not enough to fill all of the gap left by coal and oil. And so the share of natural gas, shown here in red, also increases, particularly over the first half of the outlook. To put these movements in context, natural gas demand in India and Asia and other Asia more than doubles over the first 15 years in RAPID, accounting for around 2/3 of the global growth in demand over this period. So the boost to natural gas from this supporting role in scenarios like RAPID, in which there's a relatively fast energy transition, can be quite substantial. The second component underpinning the relative resilience of natural gas is in its increasing role as a source of near-zero carbon energy when combined with CCUS. By 2050, around 40% of the natural gas consumed in RAPID is used in conjunction with CCUS, capturing over 2.5 gigatons of CO2 emissions. This share is even higher in net zero, with around 3/4 of natural gas used in conjunction with CCUS. And as you can see in the chart on the right, natural gas used with CCUS accounts for between 8 and 10% of primary energy in 2050 in RAPID and net zero, providing near zero carbon energy both directly to the industrial and power sectors and indirectly via the production of blue hydrogen. Now, I'm going to come on and say more about hydrogen in a moment, but before I do, I want to turn to the fifth question: just how quickly will renewables grow over the next 30 years? The focus here is on renewable energy used in the power sector, which includes wind and solar power, biomass and geothermal. As I mentioned at the outset, renewable energy increases sharply in all three scenarios, led by wind and solar power, shown here in the blue and yellow bars. As shown here on the chart on the right, the strong growth is underpinned by continuing pronounced falls in the cost of wind and solar energy as they move down their learning curves, with solar costs shown here in this bottom set of three lines, close to falling by 60% or more in all three scenarios over the next 30 years. This rapid growth in wind and solar power generation is made possible by a significant acceleration in the development of new wind and solar capacity. As you can see from this chart here, the growth in new capacity is particularly pronounced in rapid and net zero over the first half of the outlook, with increases in new capacity averaging close to 350 gigawatts per year in rapid and approaching 550 gigawatts per year in net zero. That compares with record increases seen in recent years of around 150 gigawatts, so a pronounced acceleration. And the sharp slowing we see in the rate of build-out in the second half of the outlook in those two scenarios reflects an easing in the pace at which wind and solar penetrate the power sector as the intermittency costs associated with their increasing use grows. Although the pace of new capacity development in BAU, shown in green, is less dramatic, average increases average around 200 to 300 gigawatts per year over the outlook, again, still significantly greater than recent build-out rates. So all three scenarios pointing to a significant pickup in the pace of wind and solar development. This faster pace of build-out, in turn, implies a significant increase in the level of investment needed to finance this development, shown here in the chart on the right. The average investment in wind and solar capacity in rapid and net zero is between $500 and $750 billion per year. That is several times greater than recent investment levels in wind and solar, and also considerably higher than the levels of investment in upstream oil and gas in these two scenarios. These levels of investment in wind and solar power may seem eye-bogglingly high at first, but it's worth noting they are roughly equivalent to only around 3% of total global business investment last year. So they are perfectly achievable if there's sufficient collective will and support. And there is more analysis of the investment implications of the different scenarios in the main booklet, so please do check that out. The strong growth in renewable energy goes hand in hand with increasing electrification of the energy system, which is the focus of the next question. As I mentioned earlier, the share of electricity in total final energy use increases in all three scenarios. What's also striking, shown here on the chart on the right, is that the increase in electricity demand is very similar in all three scenarios, growing by around 80% over the next 30 years. Strong growth in electricity in all three scenarios. In terms of the power sector generating this electricity, the key common shift in all three scenarios is a shift to a lower carbon energy mix, driven by wind and solar power, shown here in orange, gaining share relative to coal in black. So you can see in all three scenarios, this increasing share of renewable power offset by a declining share in coal. This shift in the fuel mix underpins the strong growth in renewables we just spoke about. Moreover, it plays a crucial role in decarbonising the entire energy system. A move to greater electrification, be it in transport or heating or industry, has little benefit if the energy used to generate that electricity is not decarbonised. The carbon intensity of power generation in rapid falls by 90% by 2050, compared with just 50% in BAU. Indeed, in BAU, the power sector remains the largest single source of carbon emissions over the entire outlook. In contrast, in net zero, the increasing use of bioenergy combined with CCUS, so-called BECCS, means that CO2 emissions for the power sector are net negative by 2050. The shift towards an ever-increasing share of wind and solar power begins to flatten out in the 2040s. You can see in both net zero and rapid, you can see just the pace at which the share is increasing, starting to flatten out. And this reflects as the costs associated with managing the associated intermittency rises. Batteries play an increasing role in managing this intermittency. But it's important to remember that balancing issues don't just arise over very short-term intervals, seconds, minutes, and hours. They also concern much longer periods across days, weeks, and importantly, seasons. Batteries, at least based on current technologies, are less well equipped to deal with managing these longer frequencies. And so, as this diagram tries to convey, as the importance of wind and solar power increases in different power systems, a variety of technologies and responses to balancing the energy system and ensuring the availability of firm power are likely to be needed, including hydrogen, bioenergy, and natural gas with CCUS. So the increasing use of electricity and the changing mix of power generation likely to play a central role in shaping global energy markets over the next 30 years. Thinking about the essential characteristics of a low-carbon pathway, decarbonising the power sector and electrifying end energy use are core components. But not all activities can be easily or efficiently electrified, meaning there's a role for other types of energy and energy carriers in a low-carbon system, including hydrogen and bioenergy, which is the focus of the next question. The use of hydrogen as an energy carrier increases significantly in the second half of the outlook in both rapid and net zero. The role of hydrogen in business as usual is far more limited, and so I haven't included it on these charts. Hydrogen complements the increasing electrification of the energy system in rapid and net zero by providing energy to activities which are difficult or costly to electrify, including high-temperature processes in industry and long-distance transportation, particularly heavy-duty trucks. By 2050, hydrogen accounts for around 6% of total final energy consumption in rapid and over 15% in net zero. The production of hydrogen in both scenarios is dominated by so-called green and blue hydrogen. In the outlook, all the green hydrogen is assumed to be made by electrolysis of water using renewable power. The blue hydrogen is mainly extracted from natural gas combined with CCUS. By 2050, there are broadly equal amounts of blue and green hydrogen in both scenarios. Importantly, the production of blue hydrogen helps overall global supplies of hydrogen to grow relatively quickly without relying too heavily on renewable energy. This matters for two reasons. First, relying exclusively on green hydrogen would require an even faster expansion in wind and solar capacity. This is a chart I just showed you a moment ago, showing the sharp acceleration in wind and solar capacity in all three scenarios. In the extreme case in which all hydrogen was produced using wind and solar power, to achieve the same production of hydrogen as in net zero would require even faster growth of wind and solar capacity, shown here by this blue bar. So this is how much wind and solar capacity would have to grow to achieve that same level as hydrogen as in rapid. The general point here is that relying too heavily on green hydrogen could constrain the pace at which the hydrogen economy can grow. Second, the production of green hydrogen diverts renewable energy that could otherwise be used to decarbonize the electricity used in everyday uses. This is important given that the vast majority of domestic power sectors are not fully decarbonized over the first 20 years or so of the outlook. The shift away from fossil fuels and towards a low-carbon energy system in rapid and net zero also leads to an increasing role for bioenergy. The bioenergy takes several different forms, with biofuels used mainly in long-distance transportation, doubling or more in the two scenarios. Biomethane, increasingly used as a direct substitute for natural gas, accounting for between 6 and 10% of total gas consumption by 2050 in rapid and net zero, and biomass used predominantly in the power sector. By 2050, bioenergy accounts for around 7% of primary energy in rapid and close to 10% in net zero. Our final question concerns the dangers of delaying the start of a decisive transition to a low-carbon energy system. Rapid and net zero both assumes that governments and society begin to change policy and behaviour relatively quickly, such that carbon emissions from energy use start to fall over the next few years. But in reality, there could be an extended delay before these types of changes are implemented, with the world continuing on its current unsustainable path. This possibility is explored in an alternative delayed and disorderly scenario, in which global energy system is assumed to move in line with BAU until 2030. You can see it here, moving in line for the first 10 years with BAU, until sufficient policies and actions are undertaken such that cumulative carbon emissions over the entire outlook are the same as in rapid. This assumed target for cumulative carbon emissions reflects the existence of a finite carbon budget, which implies that continuing high levels of emissions in the near term have to be compensated for at a later date. And you can see this in the red line here in this chart. So the continuing high levels of carbon emissions over the first 10 years of the outlook, when the world continues in line with business as usual, are then offset by carbon emissions falling below rapid in the second half of the outlook. Delayed and disorderly is based on the view that the longer the world continues along an unstable path, the greater the likelihood that societal pressures will grow, triggering a decisive change. To paraphrase the late, great German economist Rudi Dornbusch, the energy transition can take much longer to come than you think, but then happen much faster than expected. The scenario is obviously very stylized, since the nature of any delayed transition path will depend on the factors triggering the eventual change and the subsequent response of government and society. But importantly, the scenario is based on the assumption that it's not possible to make greater progress in energy efficiency or fuel switching by 2050 than is achieved in rapid. The significance of this is that there are real costs to delay. If the required reductions in carbon emissions cannot be met through energy efficiency or fuel switching, the only other way they can be achieved in this scenario is via widespread energy rationing. That is, policies which stop or restrict energy-using outputs or activities, generating significant economic costs and disruption. Now, in reality, other options may be possible other than outright rationing, such as various negative emissions technologies. But the general point here is that the existence of a finite carbon budget means that the longer the world continues on an unstable path and decisive action is delayed, the more costly and disruptive the eventual pathway is likely to be. The famous adage by Rudi Dornbusch was based on an earlier observation from the American economist Harold Stein, which states that if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. When applied to the current unsustainable path of the global energy system, Stein's law has pretty clear and important implications. Sometimes the simplest observations can be the most insightful. That's all I wanted to say on the 8 questions in this whistle-stop tour of the new energy outlook. To conclude, this year's outlook has changed in several respects. It's been extended to 2050 to include the period in which, at least in some of those scenarios, the pace of transition really accelerates. And the range of scenarios explored in detail has been expanded to help build a clearer sense of the range of uncertainty surrounding the future of the energy system. That span of uncertainty and common trends across the scenarios have helped to inform some core beliefs that underpin BP's new strategy. Core beliefs as to how the structure of energy demand may change over the next 30 years, with the role of fossil fuels diminishing, offset by the increasing importance of renewable energy and electricity. And core beliefs as to how the structure of energy markets may evolve as the world transitions to a low-carbon energy system, with a more diverse energy mix, greater consumer choice, more localized energy markets, and increasing levels of integration and competition. Bernard, Julia, and the rest of the leadership team will be coming back to those core beliefs over the next few days as they discuss the strategy in more detail. I've been able to provide only a brief glimpse of the analysis in this year's outlook, so if you have time, please do take a look at the full booklet. And also, please let us know what you think. We are very aware of the huge uncertainty surrounding the energy transition and the future of energy markets. So any feedback on the analysis, and even better, how it could be improved, would be very welcome.